True winter horror stories. Sometimes, reality is scarier than fiction. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 true and terrifying stories that took place during winter. Stories you won't easily forget. These aren't just made-up tales. They are real events that will leave you wondering whether winter is truly a season of magic and beauty, or a place where horrors can unfold mercilessly. Are you ready to discover what hides beneath the snow? Stick around until the end, because things are about to get even more chilling. My family owns a small vacation home in Colorado. My parents are passionate skiers, and this was the primary reason for purchasing the property. The house has been in our family since before I was born. It's clearly showing its age in many ways. It's about 40 years old, so it's not surprising that it doesn't look new anymore. Over the years, my dad has done a lot of maintenance work to keep it standing. It's still part of our family today, though it's nearing the end of its lifespan. My dad often talks about tearing it down and building something new, but I don't get involved in those discussions. This story happened around 15 years ago when I was 8 and my brother was 11. We were in Colorado during a massive blizzard. The snowfall was incredible, and naturally, my brother and I had to go outside and play in it. One of the best things about visiting this place as kids was the vast amount of open space. The property features a large clearing surrounded by woods on all sides. There's also a dead-end road that slopes downward, leading to several other similarly spacious properties. This layout made it ideal for games like hide-and-seek, snowball fights, and more. My brother Josh and I put on our winter gear to play our custom snowball game with unique rules. Essentially, we would set up 2 forts anywhere on the property, but we had to inform each other of their locations. Then, we'd create a large snowball, which we called the Jewel, and try to steal it from the other's base and bring it back to ours. Josh decided to build his fort on the nearest neighboring property. Since cars were rarely seen there, probably 9 times out of 10, we often played on their land too, assuming no one was home. For the game, we built small walls to mimic a fort and placed the big snowball behind them. To reach each other's bases, we could either cut through the woods or use the road. Once Josh ran down the road and disappeared, I was supposed to wait for him to blow the whistle signaling the start of the game. I waited for quite some time, several minutes at least. By then, he should have already set up his fort, and just needed to return to blow the whistle. After waiting for about 10 minutes, I figured I might not be able to hear the whistle from where I was, so I began planning my route. Should I go through the woods or stick to the road? I chose the road because, honestly, navigating the woods during a blizzard at 8 years old seemed intimidating. As I trudged through the unplowed snow, flakes blew into my face. However, thanks to the layers my mom insisted I wear, I wasn't cold at all. When I reached the driveway of the neighboring property, I looked through the trees but couldn't see Josh. With the bare branches and clear visibility in winter, it was easy to spot through the woods. So, I entered the property through the trees to approach stealthily, but Josh was nowhere to be found. Seeing his fort confirmed he had been there, so I looked around and, after confirming he wasn't anywhere nearby, I moved closer to grab the jewel. Before I could, I heard a woman's voice shouting, "Excuse me, are you looking for your brother?" I turned toward the sound and saw an older woman standing at the front door of the neighbor's house. I replied that we were playing a game. She responded, "Your brother isn't here." I was very confused. As I started walking toward the house, her face became clearer in my young mind. She appeared much older than she probably was, As I approached the house, I noticed someone peering out of an upstairs window. For a moment, I thought it might be Josh. It was someone with half their face covered, presumably by a black beanie, and the lower part hidden under the window frame. I also spotted another trail of footprints leading to the front door, which I assumed belonged to Josh. The woman greeted me with a strange smile. For some reason, my heart sank. She invited me inside to warm up, but I froze in my tracks and shouted, "Josh!" There was no response. Her smile faded. She hadn't expected that reaction. Additionally, I realized a second set of footprints doubled back toward the woods, as if whoever left them had returned. Then I heard heavy footsteps coming from inside the house, moving from upstairs to downstairs. Panicking, I started running, and the woman yelled something at me, or perhaps someone else, that I didn't understand. Glancing back once, I noticed the face at the upstairs window had vanished. I sprinted off the property and onto the road, retracing my steps. In the distance, I heard my dad whistling, a signal he used to call us home for dinner. By the time I reached our driveway, my dad and Josh were already there, having come to find me. Before I could explain what had happened, Josh mentioned that people in the neighbor's house had tried to invite him inside. I confirmed the exact same thing had happened to me. My dad grabbed a weapon and went to investigate while my mom stayed behind with us. He returned after a long while and reported that the front door was locked and no one answered. He then visited another neighbor who knew the owners of the house and contacted them. This is the part that still gives me chills whenever my dad recounts it. The owners weren't there that weekend, and no one was supposed to be in the house. The police were called, and my brother and I spoke to one of the officers to describe the woman. Following this incident, we weren't involved further. According to my dad, the back door was unlocked, and the house was searched but revealed nothing unusual. From that day forward, my parents removed any valuable items from the house whenever we left, fearing a potential break-in. Afterward, we avoided playing on that property altogether due to the unsettling memory. Thank goodness we never entered that house. I've been skiing ever since I learned to walk. My parents used to compete in skiing. This is actually how they met. So it was very important for them that my siblings and I learned as early as possible. Fast forward about 20 years, that's my age now, and this story happened a few years ago when I was 21. I was in my final year of college at the time. Everyone knows the best skiing spots in the Northeast are in Vermont. This trip was going to be like any other. I was with Jaden, Ryland, and Amir. I can't remember for the life of me which mountain we skied on during that trip. Jaden had arranged everything and Ryland was driving. What I do remember is that it was enormous, with 7 ski lifts covering all the different peaks. If I had to guess, it was Killington. We skied for nearly 2 full days, and I'm sure there were still trails we hadn't tried. It was that big. It was the second day. After skiing the previous day, we had a pretty clear idea of the trails we enjoyed, so this day would focus more on challenging ourselves and pushing our limits. To be honest, if I said we didn't drink some cinnamon-flavored fireball shots to boost our spirits, I'd be lying. We were having an amazing trip. The double black trails never got boring, and racing down each slope was its own little adventure. We had about an hour left before the lifts closed. We were all exhausted, but we knew that as soon as we started heading home, we'd instantly miss the mountain. While discussing how we'd end the trip near the top of the lift, 2 girls without helmets approached us. Now, this might sound strange to some people, but I wouldn't be doing the story justice if I left out this detail. The two girls, one brunette and one blonde, were incredibly beautiful. And I don't mean this in a weird way. They were objectively two of the most stunning women I'd ever seen in person. It was disarming. They introduced themselves as Taylor and Devin, and we started making small talk. They basically told us they were bored because the mountain was filled with older people, which was something I had mentioned to my friends the day before. So, it made sense why they approached us, a group of young guys who seemed around their age. Devin appeared to be an experienced skier, asking Amir technical questions about his skis. Both Amir and Ryland actually owned their own expensive skis, unlike Jaden and me, who always rented, and the girls seemed impressed by this. Taylor commented on our fireball shots, and we joked that the alcohol unlocked our true skiing potential, or something silly like that, which made them laugh. Unexpectedly, Devin pulled out an unmarked bottle and teased us, criticizing us for sticking to such a tame drink as Fireball. The four of us gladly accepted the challenge and took hearty swigs from their bottle. I noticed Ryland went a bit overboard, which wasn't surprising. He tends to drink more than he can handle. I decided not to drink too much because something about the situation just felt off. I still couldn't believe that these two girls would want anything to do with a bunch of kids like us, especially since we were wearing helmets and our faces weren't fully visible. Things were going really well, though. Amir was being his usual overly flirtatious self, but Taylor seemed into it, so I didn't complain. I figured we'd spend the rest of our time on the slopes with these girls, which I didn't mind at all. Maybe they even had plans for what we could do after the slopes closed. Just then, Devin asked us if we'd skied a trail called Devil's Forest, a name I didn't recognize at all. Our friend Chase would have remembered the trail perfectly because he's like a walking GPS, but he wasn't with us. We told them we hadn't, and they explained that it was a glade trail, usually closed. Glades are essentially trails that wind through trees, so you're skiing inside a forest. We actually prefer skiing in glades more than anything else, so this Devil's Forest trail caught our interest. We told them we were game, and they motioned for us to follow them. We reached a narrow spot, and they told us to take off our skis because we had to walk uphill for a short while. I noticed we were in a relatively remote part of the mountain, where the snow was untouched and no one else was around. But the sense of adventure was invigorating, so I didn't think much of it. Drunk and curious, we removed our skis and followed the girls uphill. Amir and Ryland went ahead, presumably to flirt more, while Jaden and I hung back a bit to give them space. As we followed, I could tell Jaden looked a little uneasy, so I asked him what was on his mind. I consider us the rational ones in the group. Amir is unpredictable and impulsive, and Ryland would follow a girl anywhere, even off a cliff. Jaden said it was strange that this supposed trail wasn't accessible via a ski lift, and I agreed. I'd never had to hike uphill to reach a trail before. We decided to stay alert. What could two girls possibly do to a group of four guys anyway? They led us into the forest, and the terrain began to level out. When Jaden and I caught up with the group, it was clear that Ryland and Amir had made significant progress. Ryland had his arm around Devin, who was laughing and smiling. They pointed in the same direction we were heading, which suddenly became a downward slope. I sighed, wishing Chase was there. He would have known exactly where we were and where the trail would lead. Jaden remained skeptical and asked the girls if they were sure this was a real trail. They replied yes and assured us it would also lead back to the lifts. Before I could say anything, Devin pulled out the bottle again and told us we had to finish it. Amir and Ryland happily took large gulps, but when the bottle reached Jaden, he said he'd had enough. The moment he spoke, I thought I saw Devin's smile turn into a brief look of anger, but when I blinked, she was smiling again. I might have been the only one who noticed because everyone else seemed fine. She put on a seductive smile and batted her eyelashes at Jaden, asking nicely. He reluctantly grabbed the bottle, just to shut her up. By the time it got to me, I raised the bottle to my lips but didn't drink. Suddenly, alarm bells went off in my head. I handed the bottle back to Devin, who put it away. I realized neither of the girls had drunk anything this whole time. I checked my phone, half an hour until the lifts closed. I tried to come up with an excuse not to ski this trail, saying we wouldn't have enough time to get back up the mountain to our car. The girls insisted we'd have plenty of time and that the lifts connected at the bottom anyway. Then, without warning, they said we were wasting too much time and took off down the slope, telling us to follow if we wanted. Amir and Ryland immediately followed, clearly hoping for a favorable outcome at the bottom. Jaden and I obviously didn't want to, but we figured we had no choice, so we followed. I let Jaden lead because, after all, this slope still looked challenging, and skiing in the forest isn't easy. I'm not sure what I expected, but when we reached the bottom, I was relieved. The four of them were already there, laughing and flirting as before. Jaden and I joined the group, but something felt wrong. There was no sign of any lift. We were still surrounded by the forest on all sides. I sternly asked the girls where the lift was, and they told me not to worry, saying it was nearby. Then they said they'd take us there in a few minutes. I relaxed a little, assuming I'd been worrying unnecessarily. As I rubbed my eyes, I heard a distinct thud in the snow. I opened my eyes to see Ryland passed out flat on his back in the snow. The girls laughed, calling him a lightweight, but I knew it was more serious than that. Before I could react, Amir slumped over too. I panicked and rushed over to them, unclipping my skis. I was thankful they seemed to still be breathing normally, but I was terrified. Jaden took a step toward the girls, asking what was happening. They acted genuinely shocked, saying they had no idea what was wrong. Jaden took another step before collapsing in the snow himself. I stared in shock, struggling to process what was happening. My head started spinning, and I realized I was next. The girls stopped pretending now and looked at me as if waiting for me to pass out. I felt dizzy, so I sat down in the snow despite wanting to stay standing. I demanded to know what they had given us. They didn't respond or move. I yelled at them repeatedly, but they ignored me. I wanted to stand, but I literally couldn't. I didn't pass out though. I kept my eyes open the whole time. Eventually, Taylor turned to Devin and muttered something like, "He must not have drunk enough." She looked annoyed, almost angry. Devin cursed under her breath and said they had to leave. I was still frozen in place. After removing their skis, I watched them take Amir and Ryland's expensive skis before disappearing into the woods. I wanted to stop them, but my body still felt numb. I couldn't let them walk off with my friend's skis though. I knew they wouldn't move quickly carrying 2 sets of skis each, especially through the snow. A few more minutes passed, and I gradually regained control of my body. I stumbled after their tracks in the snow, surprised by how far they'd gotten despite the added weight. Eventually, I turned a corner and saw them in the distance, far ahead of me. I figured as long as I kept them in sight, I'd eventually catch up. I followed them for a couple of minutes, And that's when things got crazy. The forest gave way to a clearing, which turned into a road. We must have been on the opposite side of the ski mountain entirely, which made sense looking back. That's when I noticed a van parked in the distance. I froze at the edge of the woods as the side door of the van opened, and 4 burly men stepped out to intercept the girls. The girls gestured for the men to get back in the van, and one of them turned and pointed directly at me. At that moment, I realized I was in deep trouble and felt foolish for leaving my unconscious friends behind in the woods. The men seemed to debate whether to leave or chase me, but I wasn't waiting around. I wobbled back the way I came, knowing I could find my friends again using the tracks I'd left in the snow. I found them still unconscious. I figured Jaden had consumed the least alcohol, so I tried waking him first. After throwing a few handfuls of snow in his face, he woke up enough to talk. I told him what had happened, still in shock. We tried waking Amir and Ryland, but nothing worked. Jaden and I figured we had no choice but to hope those men wouldn't decide to track us down, and they never did. I wouldn't be here telling this story if they had. We waited about an hour for our friends to wake up, and when they finally did, we told them everything. We had countless questions. Who were those girls? Who were those other men? What were they planning to do to us? It was chilling to imagine what could have happened if I hadn't pretended not to drink. In the best-case scenario, we would have woken up robbed, but even that would have been terrible. Something tells me no one would go through all that trouble just to steal from broke college kids. Besides, who keeps valuables with them while skiing? I assume Amir and Ryland's expensive skis were worth stealing, but it still seemed excessive. Plus, how did they even know we had expensive skis instead of rentals? It didn't make sense. Finding the car was a nightmare. Reporting it to the police was a nightmare. Driving back home was a nightmare. The people running the mountain promised to identify those individuals, but we obviously had to leave and couldn't verify anything. The police took it more seriously and said they'd update us if anything came up. I think it even made local news, but years have passed, and they've never found anything. To this day, we have no idea what kind of drug they gave us. Nothing online described anything so potent so quickly, especially in moderate amounts. Our best guess is that the substance was a mix of drugs, which explains why all my friends felt woozy after waking up. Those girls and whoever else was involved were truly sick people. I can only hope it was just an elaborate robbery and nothing worse. This might sound strange, but please hear me out. Every winter, my friends Kyle, Ricky, and I follow a unique tradition of walking on a frozen lake in a nearby town. It's not some grand event. We do it purely for enjoyment. There's something special about standing on the ice, surrounded by absolute stillness, that feels almost otherworldly. It's one of those simple pleasures we've always cherished. You could call us odd, but we can never get enough of that tranquility. If you've ever been alone in nature, hearing nothing but the soft fall of snowflakes, you know what I mean. It feels like having a private piece of nature all to yourself. And the photos always turn out amazing too, which is a big bonus for guys like us. This happened last winter. Now it's April, so it was about 4 months ago. I know what you're probably thinking, but don't worry, none of us fell through the ice. That's not what this story is about. It was snowing heavily that night, which was why we decided to go. The temperature had been consistently below freezing for weeks, so we were confident the lake was completely frozen. Personally, I'd choose winter over summer any day. I think all my friends would agree. There are countless reasons, but one is as simple as the beauty of snowfall. First, it's visually stunning. But what I love most is that you're never in complete darkness. Even after sunset, the world isn't pitch black. The light reflecting off the snow blends day and night, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. The moon was also full that night, amplifying the effect. Kyle was driving that evening. He has a truck that handles well in the snow, so we let him drive, even though Ricky usually chauffeurs us around. The lake is surrounded by a sparse cluster of trees, so we couldn't drive right up to the water's edge. It's not really a forest, just a scattering of trees, but it's enough to block cars from passing through. We parked in a nearby lot and got out. It was bitterly cold. We bundled up and headed toward the lake. Neither Ricky nor I smoked at the time, though I still don't, but Kyle did, so he lit a cigarette as we walked. I think it was past midnight, but I'm not sure. All I remember is that there was no one else around, not a single animal or person. Complete silence except for our footsteps. When we reached the lake, it looked entirely frozen, just as we expected. We were laughing about something silly when Kyle picked up a small rock and threw it onto the ice to test its strength. It didn't crack, so we ventured further out, though not too far. It would have been reckless. We stopped maybe 100 feet from the shore when something caught our attention on the opposite side of the lake, near where the trees met the ice. Something large and dark was moving slowly toward the lake. We froze instantly, watching silently. It was massive, hunched over, and moving deliberately. Eventually, we realized what it was: a bear. Ricky whispered quietly, "Is that a bear?" I didn't respond. My heart was pounding. If it was a bear, the last thing we wanted to do was attract its attention. We stood motionless, barely daring to breathe. But as the figure drew closer, something felt off. Its movements weren't quite right, too upright, too human. And it seemed to be dragging something behind it. Nothing made sense. It was one of the strangest things I'd ever seen. Then, suddenly, it straightened up fully, and we understood all at once. It wasn't a bear. It was a person wearing a bear costume. Kyle muttered under his breath, "What the hell?" And I was thinking the exact same thing. I know it doesn't sound scary in theory, but if you'd been there, you'd understand how terrifying it was. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I wasn't sure whether I was more afraid or confused, but instinct told me to stay silent. The figure continued moving toward the ice, dragging something behind them. At first, it was hard to make out what it was. The snow obscured the details. But as they got closer, I realized it was a rope attached to something being dragged along. A few moments later, we could see it clearly. It was a small black bag. It looked like a miniature garbage bag, if such things exist. Either way, it was unsettling. We stood there, unsure of what to do. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but my body felt paralyzed. I couldn't move. I don't think Ricky or Kyle were eager to leave either, because either of them budged. I probably wouldn't have left even if I hadn't been so scared. I needed to know what that person was doing. Then, as if the situation couldn't get stranger, the individual unzipped and stepped out of the bear's suit. Seeing them as a regular person didn't make things better. They weren't particularly large or intimidating, but there was something eerie about them. We watched as they bent down, presumably to pick up a rock, though I couldn't tell from the distance. Then came the sound. They knelt, holding what appeared to be a rock, and began repeatedly smashing it into the ice. I swear I could feel the vibrations even from where we stood. They were trying to break through, likely to dispose of whatever was in the bag. Ricky tapped my shoulder, and I turned to see him and Kyle quietly retreating towards solid ground. Without a word I followed, trying to move quickly while making as little noise as possible. Every step felt deafening in the silence, even though I knew there was no way the person could hear us from that distance. We hadn't gone far when a voice shouted behind us, "Hey!" I didn't look back. I just started running, praying they didn't have a gun. The cold didn't help. I found myself winded after less than a minute of running. I don't know if they followed. I doubt it, but we were in full panic mode. We reached the edge of the lake, and by then, I was gasping for air. After a brief pause, we hurried back to the car without saying a word, and Kyle drove off immediately. None of us had any idea what we'd just witnessed. Kyle suggested it was probably someone dumping trash, but I told him that was ridiculous. Who in their right mind would dress up in a bear suit in the middle of winter to illegally dump garbage? There was no way. Ricky said it was definitely someone disposing of a body, but I pointed out the bag was too small for that. We debated the whole ride home but couldn't agree on a plausible explanation. We never found out the truth. The reason I'm thinking about this now is because my mom was watching TV the other day, and an old missing person report came on the screen. It was about a child from our area, and the timeline of their disappearance matched closely with what we saw on the lake. I'm not jumping to conclusions. I know it's a long shot and probably just a coincidence, but I can't help wondering if those two events are somehow connected. By the time you're reading this, we've probably already reported our sighting to the police.